What if I told you that I could take you from an awkward, shy guy to a cool, charismatic man that can light up a room? What if I told you that you could become so good at talking to women that those beautiful women you leer at from the corner of your eye would actually be happy that you finally said hello? Not only is this possible, but in some ways it is far easier and more fun than you fear. Now hold on, you might say. What do you mean it's possible? I saw the title of this video. I know this is about pickup artistry. I thought that was bullshit. Well, the issue isn't whether or not it works. I've seen it work in the lives of many men, including my own. Someone I know personally literally teaches boot camps where he takes men into nightclubs and teaches them how to game. He's personally worked with some of the biggest companies doing this, and so I have like a very intimate connection with this community, with this world. I think the real problem with pickup is precisely that it does work. And I know that's a bold claim. I know that's a very, very bold claim to make. If you want another take on what exactly I mean when I say it works, you can check out my essay on red pill's epistemology. But in this essay and the next essay, we're going to go very deeply into what exactly that means. However, in this essay, I want to focus a lot on why it all goes wrong. Because I find that we're so concerned with disproving it, with trying to convince ourselves and others that it doesn't work, that we avoid the far more important question. Why do pickup artists interpret their results in the way that they do? That's the question we're going to focus on here. Why do pickup artists interpret their results in the way that they do? When the question of proof inevitably dies in the battlefield against the very real sex that pickup artists can get, our continued attempts to prove it wrong are simply ignored. Men then find themselves funneled from, I'm very lonely and I have no idea how to find a girlfriend, all the way to strategies for destroying her last-minute resistance. I'm certainly not against casual sex or even like ethical non-monogamy. But as you'll find out in the rest of this essay, the loneliness to sexual manipulator pipeline flows far more smoothly than you fear. Part 1. Homo entrepreneurialis. Before I get into that though, my name is Will and I'm a theory artist and mythwrite. And on this channel, we craft new ways to think about masculinity using psychological development and Jungian psychology. Now, getting into the actual essay, one of the most important distinctions within pickup that you need to understand is the difference between outer game and inner game. Outer game is what most of us typically think of when we think about pickup artistry. These are the routines, tactics, and strategies that people actually do in order to get sex from women. Inner game includes the routines, tactics, and strategies that a man instead performs on himself, usually over the long term, in order to become the kind of man that women would want to sleep with. So to put that in more like concrete terms, the difference is between the outer game strategy of making fun of a woman versus the inner game strategy of learning to drop your filter so that you can say the risky thing that might make her laugh very hard, but may also push it a little bit too far, kind of rides that edge between too edgy. The first is simply about the strategy of actually making fun of her, like doing that as a strategy. Whereas the other, inner game, is about addressing the internal blockages you have that might prevent you from making fun of her in certain ways or even from making fun of her at all. And depending on which company you learn from, they may prioritize inner versus outer game, giving you far more strategies for changing yourself versus strategies for specific things to do, although most companies have a bit of both. Adding to that distinction, though, is Dr. Rachel O'Neill, who likens pickup artistry as a whole to Gill's concept of mediated intimacy. Quote, her analysis identifies a series of representational patterns. The first of these is intimate entrepreneurship, whereby sex and relationships are meticulously planned for, continually evaluated, and actively managed. Second, these texts elaborate a kind of menology, explaining what men are like and giving women detailed instruction in how to please and appease them. Third is what Gill terms transforming the self. As women are called upon to remodel how they think and feel about their bodies, desires, sexual practices, and relationships. Taken together, these repertoires exhort women to work on their sexual selves and invest in an intimate skill set, to self-monitor and monitor others, to work on and transform the intimate self, to regulate every aspect of their conduct, and to present every action as the outcome of individual choice and a deliberative personal biography. End quote. You might be thinking at that point, that doesn't seem to be a quote about male pickup artists, and you'd obviously be right. This quote was about how women's magazines shape women and their approach to intimate relationships. You can imagine how much worse that has become since relationship advice magazines have largely been replaced by TikTok that are constantly in our pockets and just feeding us outrage or relationship advice in the form of outrage. And yet, if you know anything about pickup, then its description of mediated intimacy likely felt incredibly familiar to outer and inner game. Whether you're a woman reading magazines or watching TikTok or a man learning pickup, your intimacy is being shaped and organized into the form of neoliberal rationality. This basically means that you view yourself and your relationships in terms of entrepreneurship, as if every facet of your life is some sort of business metric that you must manage in order to succeed. Dr. O'Neill writes about this specifically here, quote, "In an intensely competitive romantic field in which the entrepreneur of himself has only competitors, acquiring seduction skills and amassing sexual experience provides a means for some men to gain advantage over others." End quote. This framing of romance as competitive doesn't merely extend to other men, but usually to women themselves. To give you a little bit more context, Dr. O'Neill actually conducted an ethnography of the pickup artist community in the UK. And here's a quote from her book from an instructor she talked to personally. Quote, "I fall into step with the lead instructor who jokes that by the end of the weekend, I'll have learned enough about seduction not to fall prey to it myself. He goes on to muse that perhaps all women should attend a course like this for their own self-defense." End quote. As someone who's been involved in these communities for 12 years, this kind of rhetoric is both surprising and not surprising. Often you'll have instructors and students alike justifying what they're doing as a social good. Obviously, every man should learn pickup because it would solve so many issues with jealous rage, sexual violence, dissatisfied women, the list goes on. And yet, I've also heard men claim that they wish they didn't have to do this stuff, but women are simply like that. It simply can't be helped. And so the hyper-dominant, emotionally manipulative behavior is simply a necessity to make your authenticity relatable to her biology, which she is condemned to follow. Dr. O'Neill quotes a man saying this exactly, quote, "The more I learn about PUA theory, the more it lowers my respect for people, specifically women, because it's terrible that that's what guys have to do. I would really like to live in a world where the nice guy got the girl. That's not what happens. I think most PUA theory basically works, and it saddens me slightly that this is what works. But given that it is what works, that's what I have to do." End quote. Again, this process is justified by our culture of entrepreneurialization. We are taught to view ourselves as entrepreneurs and to convert all facets of our lives into a business in which we must maximize our value to some market in order to maximize the profit we can make. In the case of romance, this means we need to conform to the sexual marketplace, in which being an alpha is the best way to get the most profit in the form of how quickly and frequently we can get sex from beautiful women. But if who you are, if who others are, and if romance itself are all defined in terms of a market, then that gives an intrinsically competitive ethos to what it means to be a human being. However, it gets much deeper than this. Not only do we learn to think like this, we come to think that this is the natural, unchangeable way of things. This is just how human beings are. This is just what we need to do if we want to succeed in romance. This neoliberal entrepreneurialization is justified through their misuse of evolutionary psychology, which turns us as human beings into homo entrepreneurialis. However much we may desire things to be different, The most real state for the human being is defined by the system of capitalism itself. As such, the self is not only reduced to the mere entrepreneurial, but it blinds us to how this process is shaping us in the first place. If this is the natural state of human being, then there's no need to turn our attention to the horizon of possibility. Instead, we turn our eyes only to conforming to reality as we find it, which often merely means conforming ourselves to what well-marketed others claim is what they did to get a lot of sex. Dr. O'Neill has this to say about this conception of the self in terms of the branded self, or viewing the self as a brand or company. Quote, "This mode of selfhood is orientated towards the pursuit of cultural value and material profit. Its production involves creating a detachable, saleable image or narrative, which effectively circulates cultural meanings, and thereby either consciously positions itself or is positioned by its context and use as a site for the extraction of value." End quote. Again, just notice how this enforces a capitalist view of yourself as a brand, as a company, that you must market in order to succeed, in order to extract the most sex from beautiful women. In my last essay, I went deep into the developmental psychology of the achiever stage. This stage is marked by a high capacity for authoring yourself or writing your own life story, but you're simultaneously being constrained by cultural assumptions that you cannot see, let alone question. What is the branded self, if not the assumption that capitalism is the natural state of human beings? Assuming that this is simply what you must do in order to get noticed by potential partners. What is this if not the demand to make an authentic brand for who you are and what you stand for, while simultaneously being blind to how viewing yourself as a brand, viewing yourself as a company, limits and constrains what you can say about yourself or do as a human being? What's more, think about how the subculture of pickup artistry itself creates a funnel of conformity, shaping the ways in which these men even can think about themselves and relationships given the form that this subculture takes. Dr. O'Neill shares two quotes on this, the first from Pascoe. Quote, "They affirm subjecthood and personhood through sexualized interactions in which they indicate to themselves and others that they have the ability to work their will upon the world around them." End quote. And the second quote from Buckbinder, quote, "Heterosexual conformation must be diffracted somehow back through the patriarchal structure, then recognized and authorized by other men. The confirmation of a man's sexuality through a woman is overlapped in his need to be validated as masculine by other men." End quote. So we have a subculture in which neoliberal patriarchal men shape the men around them to conform to their neoliberal patriarchal worldview, all through the practice of simply going out and getting better at sleeping with a lot of women. However much these men may be advised to express their authentic likes and dislikes, which, depending on the company, they are, the fact remains that this creates a very specific mold with a very specific shape. And this is what we'll turn to in the next section. Part 2, the homosocial mold of pickup artistry. So Dr. O'Neill discusses the authority given to the pickup instructor, So Dr. O'Neill discusses the authority that the student gives to the pickup artist instructor. She writes that, quote, "Students are very often enthralled to those whom they see as having realized an idealized form of masculine selfhood," end quote. In other words, because these men have, or at least claim to have, slept with greater numbers of women, they are entitled to greater authority when it comes to claims made about women in general. If you question any part of the whole ideological package that comes with the instructor, all they need to say is, "Shut up, go out, fuck 10, 20, 100 women just as I have, and you'll see what I'm saying is true." Firstly, The instructor literally makes a living by sleeping with a lot of women and teaching men how to do the same. Many have said pickup artistry is merely a numbers game. If you approach enough women, eventually you'll find one of them to sleep with. Even if that's really the only reason pickup works, the instructor will still always have a body count that surpasses any of his students. No matter how hard they try, unless they become an instructor as well, he will always have greater authority than them when authority is measured in body count. Again, he simply has more time to try to get laid than any of his students. Secondly, this creates an epistemic exemplar, a guardian of knowledge, who can only be questioned if you two have already conformed to their specific method for promiscuity. And yet, as I've argued in previous essays, just because you can get a result doesn't mean you know exactly why you got that result. It also doesn't say that the entire ideological package you use to explain why you got laid is true. You can talk all you want about how dominant, loud, and assertive men get laid the most because biology, but if you are that type of man or have become that type of man and you go out more than any other man, you really cannot say if it's the type of man you are or simply the amount of time you spend trying to get laid. Now, to be very clear, I personally don't think pickup artistry is just a numbers game, as if that's the only thing causing the difference. But you still get my point. There's a very deep level of conformity here that renders the novice pickup artist incapable of questioning the guy who literally spends hours of every day thinking about how to sleep with women better, going out to practice that, and then teaching other guys to do the same. And on top of all of that, if all pickup instructors within the industry are taught to behave in a roughly similar way, and they have the most time to go out, then they will, through sheer volume of time spent, demonstrate that this is a personality that can get laid. You might say that the fact that they're all acting that way is evidence enough, but all it may show is that they are acting in a way that is the most marketable within a patriarchal culture in which men already value being that way. And so they have the most money from clients and therefore time to go out and validate that personality. However, that doesn't say that it is the only personality that can get laid, or that it is the best, or that there could even be a single best in the first place. As we'll see, it also doesn't say whether this is the only or best type of man who could have a truly satisfying or fulfilling relationship outside the domain of casual sex. But think also about what kind of man goes to a pickup instructor in the first place, what kinds of people he will then surround himself with, and what conditions of acceptance they will place on him. Or what kinds of needs does he have, and how does that subculture shape how he understands those needs? What kinds of experiences will he be taught are necessary to satisfy that new understanding of those needs? And finally, what kind of person must he become in order to do all of that, to be accepted, right? To understand your needs, to want to satisfy those needs in that way. And what must he do to become that kind of person? Really think about those questions, because those are going to help you understand what kind of man this is, who he's going to become, and what kind of subculture pickup artistry itself is, and what the relationship between all those things is. You really need to understand that to get the point that I'm trying to make here. So let's start with such a man at the beginning of his journey. He may feel completely powerless or simply feel like he's missing something important. There may also be an element of social ostracism where he has this sense of being an outsider, looking in on all these people having normal romantic lives, or all these women who seem too foreign to connect with. As such, when he looks into pickup artistry, he sees men who have built a bridge from that outsider status to the innermost circle, having won the affection of women he views as being far above his current position. When he pays for coaching, what he's really paying for is the experience of being one of the cool guys who get it. And the it here is not just sex necessarily, but getting the entire social landscape that this novice views as a maze, as an impenetrable maze. In other words, rather than paying a woman for a girlfriend experience, He pays instructors for a cool guy experience. Dr. O'Neill writes as much here, quote, "Pickup thus enables heterosexual men, or at least promises to enable them, to act as sexual consumers without having to resort to paying for sex. In this way, the seduction industry extends a market ethos to non-commercial sexual encounters and relationships." End quote. As someone who has paid for a dating coach and been on a boot camp, I can tell you firsthand that the goal of the experience is to get me, the student, laid by the end of the weekend. However, a failure to accomplish this is foisted onto the student via neoliberal responsibilization. As homo entrepreneurialis, you are ultimately made completely responsible for whatever outcome you fail or succeed to realize. In other words, to earn belonging as a recovering loser into the conformity of pickup, you must continue until you've gotten enough lays. Or you remain a social reject too incapable of taking the responsibility necessary to fuck the quality and quantity of women you desire. Dr. O'Neill quotes a man saying just as much, quote, "I'm mad and angry, but not at pickup. I'm angry at me because it's my fault. I mean, it's not game's fault, okay? It's not game's fault, it's my fault. It's a bit like you give me a set of tools, and if I didn't know how to use those tools properly, I'm going to make a mistake. So it's not game's fault. It's my fault for not having the skills and using them properly. And so I'm not bitter for game. It's my fault." End quote. This creates immense pressure toward pickup conformity, because the only path to success becomes learning more pickup, or you are a loser, you are a reject. You have to take responsibility, and that means that you have to succeed, or you are shameful. And this is made all the more validating by the cool guy experience itself. As that unworthy loser, you suddenly find yourself around admittedly very motivating and positive men who do work hard to see you succeed. But this creates the belief that if the men that women want, like me, that must mean I really must be worthy after all. You can see now how homo entrepreneurialis is not merely a way to conceive of what it means to be human, but begins to define the contours of what it means to be a valued human. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, this bases selfhood around a man's capacity to conquer as many women as possible, and not just any women. Across racial lines, the men Dr. O'Neill interviewed had a preference for white women, especially those who conform to what they perceive to be the standard of Eastern European beauty. For men of color specifically, white women were a status symbol, a measure of acceptance into the highest ranks of masculine conformity as an alpha. This, of course, doesn't mean that no man had a preference or desire for women of color. At least for white men, women of color were likened to an exotic fruit that must be sampled and consumed in a spirit of adventure. However, adventure was still contained by an ethos of quality. The women men sought for themselves and who were most likely to win them the approval of their peers were only women who conformed to beauty standards put up by neoliberal capitalism. Again, for these men, romance is understood as a competitive marketplace where a man's value, measured in terms of his conformity to the marketplace, are exchanged transactionally for the beauty that a woman has, as measured by her conformity to the standard most often marketed by the mainstream media. Since neoliberal media is merely a consequence of the natural state of being human as homo entrepreneurialis, such standards are taken to be hardwired into the biology of these men, regardless of their country of origin or how its history with colonialism has shaped any of those beauty standards. It's all biology no matter what. So as I said, the point of this conquest of a specific type of woman is because such women act as a goalpost for acceptance into the conformity of pickup as determined by the instructor, whose authority comes only from having slept with more women than you. This falls for what is called Goodhart's law, which is the idea that once you choose something as a measure for something else, it fails to be a good measure for anything other than itself. Okay, so let's put that in concrete terms. If you choose the acquisition of sex as your measure for the knowledge authority one has in regards to women, you no longer have a good measure for knowledge. You merely have a good measure for one's ability to acquire sex. That's it. And so, with all that being said, if the acquisition of sex has become the measure, how exactly do pickup artists go about acquiring sex? And how does that system constrain their ability to understand women? Part 3, the machinery of seduction. Before I get into that though, if you do like this video, I'd really appreciate it if you would hit the like button and subscribe, because this helps the channel grow. If you like this message, then help it get out there. However, I've heard that one of the best ways for videos to get seen is for you to share with somebody who you know who has an audience or a platform of some kind, and then they can broadcast it to their audience. So I'd really appreciate that. But again, a like and subscribe is amazing. So thank you so much for that. Now, so far we've mostly covered the inner game components of pickup artistry, or how men are taught to view themselves in neoliberal terms, and then how the masculine camaraderie of pickup culture itself enforces conformity. Now, however, we can turn to outer game, or the apparatus that pickup claims can funnel women toward the goal of sex. To understand how this works and how it shapes the men who use it, we must begin again with a quote from Dr. O'Neill. Quote, "Post-Fordist sexuality includes the intensification of existing tendencies towards the systematization of sex and the extension of managerial logics to the realm of emotional life. Just as post-Fordism represents a new means to realize capitalist goals of maximizing profit within changing market conditions, so post-Fordist sex is still geared toward the maximization of male pleasure within the context of the commodification of sex." End quote. So what she's saying here is that the machinery of seduction that pickup builds is understood in those exact terms, as a machine whose efficiency and standardization become metrics to optimize in the pursuit of success measured in terms of the maximization of some sort of profit, a high quantity of quality women. The standards of successful relationships then become defined by the nihilistic hedonism of masturbatory sex. If I can acquire a lot of sex, then that must mean that I can find an emotionally meaningful relationship that is mutually beneficial and stands a chance at lasting for a long time. That logic is known as benchmarking, where the practices and benchmarks that determine success in one industry or domain are forced into another. If these strategies and personality traits work to get me sex as quickly as possible, well, then that must mean that these strategies and personality traits must be effective in any domain related to women or romance, regardless of the context, the kind of relationship, the length of the relationship, the presence of children, or the values, lifestyles, stage of development, or worldviews of the individuals involved. None of that matters. I can just get a lot of sex. You can see how this potentially overgeneralizes a small, narrow set of strategies to every woman everywhere. It also assumes that the strategies work in the way you believe they work. I've already introduced you to one of my catchphrases for criticizing red pill and pickup. Just because you got a result doesn't mean you know why you got that result. Now that we know that the result itself, lots of sex, can be a really limited measure of anything other than getting a lot of sex, we also have to wonder about the alternative explanations for why pickup works. In her ethnography, Dr. O'Neill discusses the pickup blueprint, or the systems they teach for getting a woman from stranger to slept with. Quote, "The blueprint embeds marketing logics into intimate encounters through its insistence on the carefully coordinated management of feeling, readily exploiting the codes and conventions of heterosexual romance played out in popular media culture. It is not that seduction empties sexual encounters and relationships out of their emotional content altogether. Rather, these encounters are laden with feeling, as performances of desire, intimacy, and trust are deployed tactically as a means to gain access to women's bodies." End quote. So, you create a structure for understanding the process of building romantic feelings between you and women, which in turn directs a woman toward your desired end of sex. To do this, you take advantage of and reinforce common cultural scripts about what romance is supposed to look like. However, you take this a step further and claim that the reason all of this works is because it takes advantage of a woman's supposedly unchanging biology. As I've discussed elsewhere, biology is used as a prison to confine what human beings are capable of, becoming the only or at least most powerful explanation for what human beings do or experience. For example, and this is obviously extreme, but let's say you have a guy who figures out that you can gaslight a woman into bed. From this neoliberal biological perspective, this must mean that all women are innately irrational, emotional creatures who need the strong frame of a rational male. Women need to be guided and provided for in this inherently dog-eat-dog capitalist world we find ourselves in. No, actually, you just gaslit her while actively trying to fuck her. All you can say about that experience is that gaslighting can sometimes work. So, hopefully you're getting a better understanding of what I mean when I say that pickup can work. You can 100% gaslight a woman into bed. Perhaps with enough time, in the right context, you could gaslight any woman into bed. But that still wouldn't necessarily justify the entire worldview you've built up to try to explain that all women everywhere require gaslighting to feel attraction because that's just their biology. So this is the issue with pickup artistry. They are blind to how their own ideological frame determines how they interpret the results, and so are deluded by those very real results into thinking they know exactly why they got those results. And Dr. O'Neill writes about a consequence of this, quote, "Where sexuality becomes overdetermined by market logics, it produces a kind of circumscribed sexuality that is entirely generic in its aims and ambitions. There is an emptying out of the subjective and the interpersonal, as the capitalist logic of value comes to undermine and obscure a more expansive appreciation of human values." End quote. So there's a contradiction there. On one hand, she says that pickup doesn't empty out emotion. It just controls it and manipulates it. And yet here she says it does empty out the subjective and interpersonal. By turning another person's emotions into an object to be manipulated, you remove their subjectivity and thus the interpersonal between you. You take away from them ownership and sovereignty over themselves, and thus you are incapable of interacting with them as a person. And so the interpersonal is essentially murdered. When you create a machine of seduction that is meant to push the right buttons at the right time in order to create attraction, every time it works, you now feel justified in packaging all of that up as an evolutionary predetermined formula for emotional connection and intimacy. Just because it can sometimes work doesn't mean that is why it works. What it does do is turn romance into a dehumanizing machine for the purpose of producing the nihilistic, hedonistic end of sexual consumption. In viewing yourselves through the machine metaphor of efficiency and regularity, you instrumentalize your own desire as a button that needs to be pushed via sex with a woman. She is reduced to a mere tool with so many buttons to be used in the proper way in order for your desire to be satisfied. She becomes a technical problem to be solved rather than a moral entity worthy of sovereignty over her own self, her own desires, her own interests, outside your desire of getting sex or even love from her. And so think now about how this machinery of seduction shapes how one actually treats women, given how it shapes how they interpret what women do or refuse to do. Part 4. The coy female resists what she desires. So in her book, Dr. O'Neill goes into a very extensive discussion of the concept of last-minute resistance, or LMR. To explain, let's say you've taken a woman home. You've made out, things seem hot, maybe she's even like grabbed at your body, etc., right? She has all but consented to penetration. Then, at this point, she says no. This is LMR, or last-minute resistance. She resists your desire for penetration at the last minute, despite everything pointing to penetration happening up to that point. Now, you might say, hey, that's totally her right. Just because she was down to make out, touch your dick through your dreams, dry hump, suck you off, or whatever else she was willing to do, that does not in any way mean she was open to penetrative sex. I, of course, agree with that. There are many things that can be fun to do other than penetrative sex, and there's no reason that those things require penetrative sex or even orgasm to enjoy on their own terms. But if your definition of successful intimacy has been defined as penetrative sex to your orgasm, then that creates pressure on you to do everything in your power to get that result. Remember that your position as a valued human being is defined by your ability to get a result, penetrative sex, as quickly as possible with as many high-quality women as possible. To fail to do so is to fail at being fully human. And I myself have been in the position where a woman gives LMR and it can feel shame-inducing. Did I do something wrong? Is there something wrong with me? Why wasn't I enough? This is the language of toxic shame. Understand that when you experience yourself to be less than human, you experience that as a very, very deep shame. When being human is defined as getting sex, you feel ashamed when you fail. So you can see a very powerful pull of conformity in which your personhood has been defined by your ability to get sex. You fail to get that sex, so you don't deserve to be a full person. And so you better do whatever you can to get that sex and to be able to experience yourself as being fully human. So taking all of that into account, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about specific strategies for dealing with LMR. I think it's more important to follow Dr. O'Neill in outlining how the concept of LMR itself can shape how a man interprets what a woman does. How is this interpretation used to justify certain actions, and as I'm sure you are ominously aware of, the consequences of those actions? First and foremost is the dictum shared by Rollo Tomassi, the godfather of Red Pill. Quote, base your estimation of a woman upon her actions and behaviors rather than her words or implied intents. Behavior is the only reliable evidence of motivation. End quote. This dictum is further echoed by a man who Dr. O'Neill had interviewed. Quote, what girls will say they want and what they respond to are just two completely different things. End quote. When applied as an unfortunate addition to LMR, we can now understand the real reason a woman would give LMR in the first place. If she's willing to do all this other stuff, why stop short of penetrative sex? Well, because she doesn't want to be perceived as a slut. She gives LMR in the hopes that you'll persist so she'll still get what she really wants. But you won't think she's easy to get. In other words, LMR is not a legitimate statement of a lack of desire to have penetrative sex, but a necessary deception that you as a man must deal with in order to earn sex from her. Her verbal no is only a way in which she can give her sex up without feeling like a slut. It may seem obvious how this becomes a powerful vehicle for disregarding a woman's consent in favor of what you're able to get her to do. If you can get her to give you sex, then that's all that matters. She gave you sex, so she wanted to give you sex, even if she said otherwise. Dr. O'Neill discusses the consequences of this. Quote, Under the precepts of LMR, men are exhorted to fulfill the desires women are presumed to have, but are purportedly unable to expressly articulate. What is more, by insisting that women's verbal communication is not simply ambiguous but deceptive and misleading, LMR licenses men to disregard what women say and to do so in the earnest belief that they are in fact fulfilling women's unspoken and unspeakable desires. End quote. So, Dr. O'Neill then shares a sex story told to her by a man named Rahul. Prepare yourself. Quote, "When we got in the car, that's when it got a bit more physical. I started undressing her, but we didn't have sex then. It's almost as if she kept stopping me. This has happened before as well. So, I had her breasts out, but she wouldn't let me go any further than that. And then we drove. I said to her, let's go to my place, we'll watch a movie. So then we went to my place, but then we parked near my house. It was like cat and dog, literally. I was in the car, chasing her in the car, right? And she was playing hard to get. I was just playing the game because I knew that she wouldn't let me seduce her. It was like she wanted to have sex, but she wanted to make it a bit difficult. She was one of those personality types that wanted to be broken through." End quote. Dr. O'Neill then analyzes this experience. Quote, "Rahul claims to be able to intimate women's desires, thereby permitting himself to disregard verbal objections and physical resistance. He further contends that, despite this woman's protestations, she wanted to be overpowered by him. Rahul generalizes from this experience, as he later went on to contend a lot of women are looking for that. He proceeded to describe, apparently without concern, that this encounter was interrupted when police arrived to investigate reports of a woman screaming." End quote. Within the mind of a pickup artist, they are perfectly capable of understanding what women do, and then they use their apparently perfect powers of interpretation to justify whatever behavior they employ in their attempts to get sex from the woman. So here's another story that Dr. O'Neill discusses in her book. And keep in mind that this was posted by a pickup instructor on his own website. So definitely prepare yourself for this one. Quote, "After her cigarette, I suggest we go inside, where the only place to sit is on the bed. Then I go to kiss. She fights me off a little until I grab her neck, throw her back onto the bed and kiss her. Then she likes it. The next 20 minutes are a technical masterclass in beating LMR. Her body is screaming out for sex, but she's determined not to do it. She's moaning feeble protests and not really making any effort to disengage. Then I get my dick out and put her hand on it. We're not going to have sex, she says, as she starts giving a hand job. It's time to get sneaky. I pull my trousers off and finger her while I'm kneeling between her legs. When I judge her to be a maximum arousal, I put my dick in and raw dog her. I don't want the pause while I put on a condom. Her eyes briefly go wide, she whispers, 'Don't,' and then I'm fucking her. Within 10 seconds, she's all in, arms and legs wrapped around my back, pulling me in. It's dirty, raw, hard sex. Fucking awesome. Afterwards, I interview her. She tells me she really didn't plan to have sex, but once it started, she loved it. She also tells me she really enjoyed the process of being skillfully seduced, knowing what I was up to and just appreciating the skill of it. She rated the sex 9 out of 10. End quote. I'll get into a deeper discussion of consent in the next section, but notice the assumption here. As a pickup artist, you assume that your perfect powers of interpretation are in no way, shape, and form determined by your own frame of reference, in which your toxically shameful pursuit of sex to validate your humanity is justified by misused evolutionary psychological narratives. You are the red-blooded male with his endless sexual appetite, and she is the coy female who will feign disinterest to avoid being perceived as a slut, but do anything once she knows she's with a true alpha male like you. No, it couldn't be that belief system shaping your interpretations of her verbal and physical protests. It has to be that you are perfectly correct and she really does want you to hold her down and rape her without a condom. Notice also how this story is written like an erotic novel. Imagine being a man learning pickup, getting turned on by the thought that you too can fuck as many beautiful women as that author does. Such stories are shared by men who will talk about their own progress, giving the novice a map to understand their painful loneliness as something that must and can only be cured by engaging in the same kinds of activities and achieving the same goals. The normalizing of disregarding what women do or want in favor of your own desires for her is wrapped up in a story that excites, motivates, and guides other men into a similar future. And Dr. O'Neill continues by analyzing another man's statement. The man says, quote, "I'll just make it happen, and she has to be fine with that." End quote. Dr. O'Neill writes the following about that statement. Quote, "This man's purported knowledge of women's sexual desires, knowledge he has gleaned from a book written by a man for other men, rather than a woman's perspective on the matter, serves as an authorizing mechanism to pursue a relation of dominance and submission that is not discussed or agreed upon with individual partners, but always assumed in advance and enacted with impunity. Whatever the predilections of individual women who may well enjoy sexual power play, the assumption that all women secretly desire to be sexually overpowered by men sets up murky conditions for consensual sexual relations and ripe conditions for sexual coercion." End quote. We can see here how easily the concept of last-minute resistance can be used to justify disregarding and pushing past a woman's verbal or physical protestations. However, what we need to understand is how this leads to the manufacture of consent within the mind of the pickup artist himself. How is it that they can rationalize to themselves that a woman has consented despite obvious evidence to the contrary? Part 5, Manufacturing Consent. So let's begin with yet another post made by a man learning pickup. I promise this is the last one. Quote, "As soon as we got in, I started kissing her and laid her on the bed. Had her down to her panties and had my cock out. Was fingering her and trying to fuck her, but she wouldn't let me stick it in. At one point she was on top of me, rubbing her clit on my knob, but still refused to fuck. With one last ditch effort, I was on top of her with my cock on her hole, but couldn't get it in. WTF. She left my place soon after and hasn't responded to a text today. She obviously wanted it." End quote. The biggest thing I want to call attention to again is that a woman can be perfectly fine doing all sorts of things, but that is not consent for anything she says no to. She was okay doing one thing with her vagina, but refused when you tried to do something else. That's okay. She's entitled to have that boundary. You cannot try to force her past that boundary and then act surprised when she continues to say no. Dr. O'Neill, though, has this to say about that story. Quote, "Seduction knowledge practices encourage men to view sex as the outcome of their own skillful maneuvering. There's a categorical assumption that, when properly implemented, these techniques guarantee sex. Indeed, this commenter appears to be entirely at a loss as to why this woman refused to have sex with him, given that, by his own assessment, she obviously wanted it. Unable to understand why she may have left so abruptly, he regards her refusal to communicate with him after this encounter as unfathomable. In this way, seduction relies on and reinforces a worldview where women are indeed valued for their capacities to satisfy impulses. And they are also seen as deserving understanding because they can present all sorts of annoying technical problems. What they are not seen as is subjects whose thoughts and feelings are of equal value to men's." End quote. Firstly, are women's thoughts and feelings really not of equal value to men, according to the pickup artist? I want you to understand equal value here as understood on equal terms. In other words, do these men view women as sufficiently different from themselves that they feel justified in behaving toward them in ways that are different from how they treat men? So I'm not going to spend too much time on this specific little part here, but if you want a deeper dive, you can check out my essay, Alpha Male, Submissive Female. In that essay, I talk about research on agency, or the pursuit of self-interested goals, and on communion, or the pursuit of other-interested care. In brief, red pill and pickup artists tend to view men as being hyperagentic and rational, whereas women are seen as being hypercommunal and emotional. I then discuss research on stereotypes to show how this is amplified and radicalized to the point that women are seen as having very little agency and are in need of a man to make all the decisions for them. This misconception of femininity is manifested through the idea that you can't trust what a woman says because her truth is her emotions. Be less focused then on what she says and be more focused on making her feel a certain way. Again, notice how this reframes a woman as an object to be acted upon through skillful maneuvers that get her to feel whatever you need her to feel in order to get what you want from her. She is no longer an equal agent with her own desires, but a complex lock that desires to be unlocked by a skillful enough man. Again, no matter what she may say, do, or think, all women are assumed to desire a man who pushes until she unlocks, or until she makes it too difficult for him to find it worth his time or freedom from legal action to continue. And Dr. O'Neill has this to add on that. Quote, conducting themselves in accordance with seduction precepts, their capacity to relate to women as relational subjects, whole persons, whose thoughts and feelings are just as important as their own, is radically diminished. Instead, an ethic of self-interested individualism prevails. End quote. If you are raised in an individualistic culture in which a person's worth is determined by their ability to enact their self-interested agency in the world, what does that say about the person who you believe is fundamentally, irreversibly other-interested? Not only are you already biased toward privileging your own self-interested goals and disregarding those of others in a dog-eat-dog game of capitalist achievement, but you'll automatically consider the other-interested person, the woman, as being biologically less capable of equal participation in the very games you think are the most important games to be played. So when we get to the specific game of acquiring sex, our self-interested goal, we can already see the consequences of this in the very framing of sex as an acquisition. Throughout this essay, I have spoken of what the pickup artist is doing as getting sex. This is a consequence of viewing oneself as hyper-agentic and women as hyper-communal. As an agent, you are self-interested, and so your engagement with the world is defined by the things you get for yourself. Whereas as communal, she is other-interested, and so her engagement with the world is defined by the things she gives to others. Furthermore, because we live in a capitalist system, we are shaped to view our relationships in the transactional terms of exchange, in which negotiations take place between two self-interested competitors. If women are perceived as other-interested and in possession of a coveted resource, then their engagement in negotiation will very easily have them viewed or framed as the haggled rather than the haggler. Here, the haggler is the one who has skill to haggle, whereas the haggled is the one who is skilled in avoiding the haggler's manipulations. In such a framing of romantic relationships, the haggled is very easily reframed as having lost something in the exchange. It is the skill of the haggler to get more than they lose in their negotiations with the haggled. And so all of this contributes to women being framed as differently enough from men that their engagement in the sexual can be understood in the very terms we've already discussed. They are non-agentic objects that are acted upon. They must be acted upon with a certain level of skill in order to be convinced. The fact that they must be convinced means that they may give signs of disinterest even though they may still want the trade. As such, a woman's disinterest is a sign that she is really interested, however deep down. You as a man are then justified to push as hard as you want with your skill set of sexual persuasion, which obviously rides ominously close to sexual coercion, in order to get what you self-interestedly want, as long as you actually get what you want. This is how a man goes from, I must persuade her to want sex, to, I got what I want, therefore I know why I got what I want. That is to say, this is how he manufactures consent. He removes her ability to say no, because if she says no, that means she was really interested. If she says yes in the face of your domineering persistence, that couldn't possibly be because she fears how escalated your already escalating violence could further become. It must mean she was really interested. And if she doesn't want to see you again, then it's because she has buyer's remorse, or it was a one-time thing she'll remember fondly as her hoe phase. If she doesn't report you to the police, it's because you did nothing wrong. Not because she's too ashamed and wants to pretend it never happened, and not because the possibility of legal action is too insurmountable for her to want to invest the time and emotional energy in an already traumatizing experience. Oh, and by the way, when she rated the sex as 9 out of 10, that couldn't possibly be because she fears the man who literally threw her on the bed and forced her to have sex despite her verbal and physical protestations. Like, Jesus fucking Christ, is she really going to tell the guy who just raped her, oh yeah, by the way, the sex was kind of shit? All told, such a man is able to walk away believing that everyone had a great time simply because he never had to face the consequences of his actions. As such, he never has to question this worldview that's defined as the neoliberal machinery of intimacy, manufacturing consent from the slut-shamed coy female. The more results he gets, the more justified he feels that he really understands women after all, and the more confident he feels to brag about these experiences, rape or not, on the internet, teaching other men to think of intimacy, sex, and romance along these same lines. So you might ask yourself at this point, but where's a woman's sexual agency to be able to walk away or just say no? In these stories, they did say no, and the men acted more dominant, thinking that's what was necessary and desired. From a woman's perspective, that isn't him necessarily being dominant and sexy. That's him literally becoming more violent and demanding. I mentioned this before, but a woman doesn't know how violent such a man will get. She may decide that she may as well play along so he doesn't attack her. For many men, they'd prefer giving a handjob, a blowjob, or even just having sex than to risk a violent rape, and so many women actually do that. Of course, we can't base our culture on the worst of men, teaching every woman to fear that every man might be a rapist or murderer. However, when she has clear, direct evidence that he is willing to get more physically domineering when she says no, how could she possibly know at that point if this specific man could be the one who rapes her or even murders her for saying no? He literally became more violent. He literally did that. Where is a woman's sexual agency when we demand that she fight tooth and nail to avoid unwanted sex, forcing her to risk terrifying violence, perhaps even death? Think about that. What sexual agency is it when it's risking death or giving up for unwanted sex? How can we then act surprised when women, given this false notion of sexual agency, blame themselves for having put themselves in that position in the first place? And at the end of the day, remember, it's not often the rapist murderer, but ordinary men with ordinary women in ordinary places. At this point, though, you might also ask, how does such a man smooth over those experiences that do go bad? Obviously, along the path of getting better with women, such a man is likely going to have experiences that range from the awkward hiccup to the deeply humiliating before getting anywhere near the criminal. In the next section, I'm going to start to dig into how exactly a woman is perpetually viewed as a technical problem rather than as a moral entity. Part 6, the cruel optimism of the caliber woman. Now, before I continue with that, if you really like this message and you want to support the channel, the best way that you can do that is to check out my Patreon. I release exclusive like monthly Q&As, early access to videos and things like that. So if you like this channel, I would really appreciate you check that out. I want to keep as much of my content as free as possible. That's just my values, but helping it will help me invest more time and energy into this. So again, I would really appreciate you check that out. You can find a link to it in the top comment below or in the description of this essay. So thank you so much for that. So getting back to the essay, one of the consequences that you need to think about of redefining yourself as homo entrepreneurialis is that you are taught to be biased toward what's called a future perfect or anterior perspective. This is a grammatical tense in which you say, by this time tomorrow, I will have done and experienced this. The point is that you project yourself into the future and then look back at what has happened from that point. Self-improvement culture does this in general because they get you to envision your bright future and then backwards engineer the steps you need to take in order to get there. For the pickup artists then, they envision a future in which they have the lifestyle and relationships with the quantity and quality of women they desire. And so, to be 100% clear up front, this is not necessarily a bad thing. However, I want you to think about the consequences of this view when matched with the ideology of red pill and pickup artistry. Dr. Lauren Berlant writes about the affective structure called cruel optimism. An affective structure is a relation between a person and an object or collection of objects which organizes their affect or their emotions. Cruel optimism, then, is an affective structure in which a person is bound to an object situated in the future that they are optimistic they will actually get, but, unfortunately, it drives them into a pursuit that is essentially killing them slowly. As they move toward that goal, any emotions they feel are organized by their optimism to perpetuate their pursuit. For example, if they fail at some step and feel ashamed, that must become reframed as motivation to keep trying hard because next time they'll get it, and all that shame will have meant something. Optimism in this sense then is not some flowery, happy-go-lucky feeling, but is the way that even dark feelings are shaped and organized in order to keep us marching forward. You simply can't stay that shameful failure. You must achieve your dreams or die trying. You can see how this is a future anterior relationship. Because if we envision a bright future where we will have had all these experiences with all these beautiful women, then in the present, we are driven to continue taking action regardless of what happens in that present. Our success is always right around the corner. And so whatever humiliation, anxiety, or anger we feel, these are all the costs of the struggle in the name of that vision that's definitely going to happen. Again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is not necessarily a bad thing. If we're after some goal, then obviously we want to be optimistic because that will organize our emotions and actions in a way that will get us toward that goal. And that could be amazing. That could be great. Goals are good. Okay, goals are good. The issue is when optimism becomes cruel, when the specific goal we're pursuing ends up being an obstacle to our flourishing. We are essentially deluding ourselves that the goal we seek will help us flourish, when in reality it is, again, slowly killing us, slowly making our lives and the lives of others worse. So for the ideology of pickup, the specific object cruel optimism gives men is the idea of their woman of caliber. This is a woman who is in near perfect alignment with what a man desires, both physically and personality-wise. But notice firstly how this contrasts with Red Pill's notion that the quality woman doesn't exist. There are differences between Red Pill and Pickup. As I said all the way back in my first essay on Red Pill, even it is not monolithic with everybody believing the same thing. Pickup's view tends to be that the only thing separating a man from such a woman, this caliber woman, is his skill level and his willingness to put in the effort to find her or make her from some woman he's found. right? On top of that, if you settle for someone less than the woman of caliber, then you're always going to feel dissatisfied because you know that you could have found someone better. As a red-blooded male, your sexual appetites will never be satisfied by anything less. This idea is further reinforced because they use promiscuity as a means of marketing their pickup coaching. They're not only using your hope for a long-term relationship with a caliber woman, but they'll also talk about all the amazing experiences you will have had with increasingly beautiful women in the meantime. So I hope you see here the specific set of beliefs that are orienting you toward your desires in a way that constrains the kinds of relationships you even can envision in your future, and thus the kinds of actions you must take in the present. Most human beings desire a relationship with someone they love, and most men are probably interested in sleeping with beautiful women. Within this ideology, though, desire is organized in a way where it can only be truly satisfied by the caliber woman, right? This near perfect alignment, all these things fitting in place that have to be near perfect. And the only way to find such a woman is to commit yourself to the ideology of pickup and the promiscuous lifestyle it entails. To be clear, I'm not against promiscuity, okay? You live your life as long as you do so in ways that are healthy for you and others. What that means is obviously up for debate. But the point is that they're using your more short-term desires for things like casual sex. They amplify them through fantasy and imagery, and they justify them as not only normal and natural because it's biology, but they actually create a hierarchy of status and dominance, where you climb the hierarchy of valuable men if and only if you can get sex with more beautiful women. And then after all of that, they then hook these desires to those for a long-term loving relationship, making it seem as if it's only really possible if you have had the promiscuous lifestyle climbing the social hierarchy of conquered beautiful women. And all of that works to organize and structure your emotions, your desires, your experiences, your entire life in a very particular way. And funny enough, that particular structure also just so happens to require that you invest money in coaching to get better at pickup itself. Remember, my point in saying this is not that pickup doesn't work to get you more sex or even help you find a long-term relationship. It's instead that it does work, but the reasons for why it works present a whole host of issues, because it's presented as the only real method to truly experience the most satisfaction in your life and relationships. Any other path is considered the coping mechanism of lesser men who will settle for a woman they'll never experience true happiness with, or who will even cheat on them because their skill set simply wasn't good enough. And if any of that stuff happens, in any context ever, then it can be used to validate the pickup ideology and all the baggage that comes with it. The fact that this is often emotionally heated material means that in our age of outrage-biased algorithms, we'll see that far more than we see examples of normal relationships that work out well despite the lack of pickup or red pill ideology. This is how cruel optimism works. It creates a higher order structure to define the terms and conditions of our life choices, all in the name of achieving a future that most people would want to feel optimistic about. Unfortunately, often that future is not even possible. However, even when it is possible, such as a long-term relationship, those terms and conditions constrain us in ways that we don't realize. Perhaps they even cause us to redefine that future in ways that become so unhealthy that attaining it would destroy us. And yet, what if it could make that possible future impossible to ever reach? Part 7, the nostalgic chains of the future anterior. So in that last section, I talked about cruel optimism in more abstract terms, but I want to try to get a little more concrete. I think we can also show a really beautiful example that cruel optimism doesn't require the excitement or positive emotion that we typically associate with optimism. In this case, I'd like to take a look at how a future anterior relationship with the present can shape the effects of nostalgia. So typically, nostalgia is a past-oriented emotion in which we feel like a yearning or appreciative remembrance for our past. However, once we've conditioned ourselves into that future anterior perspective, by this time tomorrow I will have experienced this, nostalgia can then become a future-oriented experience. While we position ourselves in that future, that nostalgia can actually influence us in different ways, depending on whether we imagine that nostalgia in the hypothetical future or feel it in the present, given what we imagine the future will be like. So that's complex. Let's try to make that all concrete, like I said. The first form of nostalgia I want to look at is anticipated nostalgia, but for ease of understanding, I'll refer to this as future nostalgia. This is the nostalgia you predict you will experience in the future when you look back at all the experiences you're either having right now or will have had between now and that future. So you're not experiencing nostalgia right now, but you're imagining that you will experience nostalgia 5 years from now when you can look back at all these women you will have slept with. How does future nostalgia actually affect us though? According to research, it makes us feel excited and curious toward the future. Additionally, it can lead us to savor the experience, to capture it so that we can remember it better, which is in turn associated with actually remembering positive experiences better. It was also associated with actually feeling more self-esteem, social connectedness, and meaning once you actually got to that future and feel that real nostalgia looking back, like time has actually passed. So through future nostalgia, you're facilitating a deeper relationship with your present, and so you're motivated to drive yourself toward your optimistic future of the caliber woman. Even if you haven't found her yet and are still involved in the pickup lifestyle, when you look back at the previous months, you'll feel even more self-esteem, social connectedness, and meaning through pickup, giving yourself more reason to drive yourself deeper into the pickup ideology. This is all because of the fact that pickup had created the future anterior nostalgic vision of the caliber woman and the wanton sex necessary to get her in the first place. Again, within the ideology of pickup, they teach you to think like this because they're using marketing to appeal to this desire. The best way to market to men who are lonely or just aren't satisfied with their dating life is to get them to envision a future in which they don't have these problems. The issue here is that this has a feedback loop where if you make them envision a future full of beautiful women, they then begin to believe that they need to have had those experiences in order to solve their loneliness and dissatisfaction. In other words, through the power of future nostalgic marketing, a man is taught that every time he feels loneliness, dissatisfaction, or the difficulties of learning pickup, he must envision a bright future in which he will feel nostalgic for having had all these experiences with lots of beautiful women. These emotions become cues to believe what the ideology tells him to believe, which then causes him to act in ways that make it more likely he'll get sex, which in turn will make it more likely that he'll believe what the ideology is telling him is true. If it got him laid, he will assume it knows exactly why it got him laid. The possible solutions for a good life narrow around a very small set of strategies. And then here we can introduce the other form of nostalgia, which is called anticipatory nostalgia. But I'll refer to this as present nostalgia. Present nostalgia is experienced when we envision a future in which we've lost what we currently have which makes us feel nostalgic in the present moment about what we still currently have. And so this can be a little bit confusing, okay? Again, future nostalgia is where we expect to feel nostalgia in an imagined future for the things we will have experienced by then. But present nostalgia is where we feel nostalgia right now for the things we will have lost by then. Now, how does present nostalgia for the things we fear we'll lose work to cement pickup ideology? It depends on how we feel about our current predicament. Think about it. If you're taking care of your mom while she's dying of cancer, and you're made to feel present nostalgia, that means you'll start feeling anxiety about losing her, which will make you start looking at how close you've become during this experience and how much you appreciate these last moments with her. Despite the bad experience of watching cancer eat your mom alive, you're able to take a more positive perspective because of what you know you will have lost in the future. Your mom. On the other hand, if you're having a really amazing time with your girlfriend and you're made to feel present nostalgia, you're going to feel anxiety about the possibility of losing her one day. Because your circumstance is positive, the anxiety you now feel is going to decrease the amount you can actually enjoy your time with your girlfriend because you're just too busy being anxious. In this case, the present nostalgia doesn't make you appreciate the good in a bad experience, but makes you too afraid of losing the good experience to actually enjoy this good experience. So let's consider a man who has been in pickup for a while. He's gotten laid a lot, and he believes he's found the caliber woman. Now he's considering leaving the pickup lifestyle and settling down with her. Let's say he watches a pickup artist video that gets him into the future anterior perspective, where he envisions all the women he's slept with. Think about what's going on here that's different from when he first got into pickup artistry. Now, he's not thinking about all the women he will have slept with by some future state. He's thinking about all the women he has already slept with and comparing that to the present prospect of monogamy. In other words, he's being made to take a future anterior perspective in which he has lost the pickup lifestyle and the frequent sex he was and may even still be having. Given this future anterior perspective, he will feel present nostalgia for the things he has right now. Let's then say that things are going really well with the potential caliber woman. He's now triggered to feel present nostalgia in a positive circumstance. But he is specifically feeling that nostalgia about the current pickup lifestyle. Now, he's afraid of what he'll lose and is going to be more likely to push that caliber woman away. The fact that he feels anxiety with her means that he'll associate her with anxiety and think maybe, just maybe, she isn't really that caliber of a woman after all. What if there's someone better out there, someone who's more in alignment with the kind of man he is? Then, let's say he goes out with his friends. And because he's been spending more time with this new woman, he's a little bit rusty. He has a bad night out, which even happens to the best pickup artists when they're fully invested in the lifestyle, let alone someone who's a bit rusty. So, after the fact, he watches a pickup video to try to figure out where he went wrong, and the marketing in that video gets him to take the future anterior perspective where he feels nostalgia for what he will have lost. He's now feeling that present nostalgia in the bad circumstance of a bad night out, realizing how much status he's built that he now has to lose, how much value as a human being he might lose, how much he appreciates the pickup lifestyle for all that it has done for him up to this point. So what is this man likely to do? He's likely to go back into pickup where he will no longer be fearing what he'll lose, but envisioning all the experience he still has yet to have. Now the future anterior perspective of pickup marketing will not be present nostalgia that pushes him away from monogamy and back into pickup, but the future nostalgia that will make him savor so much more of the pickup lifestyle itself. I hope you can see how this future anterior stance of projecting yourself into this future and looking back at the present can cause a shift and change in the emotions you feel, depending on your present circumstance. Every time a guy goes for monogamy, the nostalgia he projects himself to feel could shift from the future to the present and back again, precisely in a way that cements him even further into the pickup ideology itself. Even though Dr. O'Neill doesn't talk about this in the language of like cruel optimism or anticipated and anticipatory nostalgia, she does talk about the difficulty men have leaving the pickup lifestyle. They're afraid of settling down with the wrong woman. They fear that if they stop going out, they'll eventually become that anxious, introverted loser all over again. And then, the potential caliber woman they've found will stop loving them anyway. They can convince themselves that a successful, loving, monogamous relationship actually depends on them staying longer in pickup, and, allegedly, women prefer much older men anyway. Just another belief that acts to keep them trapped within the ideology. Their cruel, optimistic attachment to the sublime object of the caliber woman keeps them invested in an ideology that shapes how they understand themselves as hyperagentic and women as hypercommunal. This further justifies the machinery of seduction that has them remove a woman's right to consent. And all of that acts as an obstacle to the very future that motivated them to get into pickup in the first place. A loving relationship with a woman they're compatible with. Through the pickup artist ideology that gives them beliefs that shape and organize their emotional experiences, they've trapped themselves in the future anterior affective structure of cruel optimism. And for those of you who've seen my series, The Psycho-Spiritual Prison of Masculine Conformity, I hope you're seeing how this description connected with the chained vortex of affect, and with the epithemian desire driving us toward the Tantalus. Think about how pickup artistry and Red Pill represent the Kathekon, and consider how they position themselves against the Akkadian feminism that would stop them from doing pickup. I hope you're beginning to see how all of this is working together to keep such men trapped in an ideology that is decidedly toxic. However, despite everything we've covered, it may still seem strange how these men can view women and themselves along these terms. There's just so much here that should wake them up to the fact that they're stuck in a cruel optimism that is hurting them and the women they engage with. One reason this happens is what we'll discuss in the final section. Part 8. The deferred morality of promissory futures. Throughout my series on Red Pill's worldview, I outlined a lot of the loops in logic that send them back into the worldview every time it's challenged. However, I think there's one very important element that I only discovered through writing this essay. It's the way in which their worldview operates to frame a woman as a technical problem rather than as a moral entity. Questions are asked only as, how can I get this result? Rather than, should I do this to get the result? Throughout this essay, then, I've discussed how through the machinery of seduction, you're taught to view women as a technical problem or object meant to be acted upon. There are certain processes and procedures that we have to engage in order to get the sex or even a long-term romance from a woman. Even if you escape the ideological gravity well of the pickup lifestyle, you're still stuck with this instrumentalizing view of a woman as a technical problem. And we already know that they view women as naturally submissive and demand she conforms herself constantly to a man's frame, to his worldview. So you can see how that would influence the quality of a relationship they do end up getting into. However, while learning pickup, I think the idea of promissory futures can help us understand how they justify immoral behavior that they themselves may even recognize as immoral. Dr. O'Neill offers the two following quotes taken from men she interviewed. Quote, "The more I learn about PUA theory, the more it lowers my respect for people, specifically women, because it's terrible that that's what guys have to do. I would really like to live in a world where the nice guy got the girl. That's not what happens. I think most PUA theory basically works, and It saddens me slightly that that is what works. But given that it is what works, that's what I have to do." End quote. The second man says, quote, "You know, it could actually, in the mind of someone twisted, it could lead to rape." End quote. There are men within this community that express ambivalence about the potential immorality of pickup tactics. However, it's often smoothed over by saying that if this is what works, then that's just what we have to do. Again, I wish the nice guy got the girl, but that's simply not how it works. It may also be justified by appealing to the morals of the man himself. Manipulation in the hands of a good man is assumed to be justified once he will have created a positive outcome for everyone involved. Again, we return to the future anterior perspective of by this time tomorrow, I will have experienced this. Obviously, we could question whether or not a positive outcome is actually a positive outcome, but let's pretend that what they're doing is definitely going to lead to a positive consensual experience. Unfortunately, even me saying that is a promissory future. Elkin colleagues define promissory to mean both a promised future as something that is definitely going to happen, and a promising future in which whatever is going to happen, is definitely going to happen, is going to be good. They then discuss this promissory future as a specific tactic used in moral competition to convince your opponent that your strategy is aligned with their desired outcome. The example they use is the British Health Services cutting costs with the promissory future that it would definitely lead to a better healthcare system for everyone involved. The issue is that you're using a promised future, not a present reality, to justify actions that may or may not actually lead to that positive outcome. In fact, you could literally be giving somebody a cruel optimism in which your actions prevent the flourishing you promised them. So to be very clear, a promissory future is meant to shut someone up by promising them, oh yeah, totally, what we're doing is definitely going to benefit you, eventually, one day, maybe. So when applied to pickup, the promissory future that the pickup artist uses to justify their manipulations is that positive consensual experience. This is just how women are. This is just what I have to do. And so once I do it and I get the sex, then obviously she's going to be grateful that I approached her in the first place. This narrative of gratitude is something I've heard a lot in the industry and community. Women want to meet a cool guy who will have a bunch of fun with them, take them home, and have great sex. That's not wrong, but it is still a promissory future, a hypothetical that has not yet happened. Like, what a blessing to have had a guy who is willing to put the effort in to make the first move, take the necessary actions to get her interested and comfortable, and to help her fulfill her desires for sex without making her feel like a slut. That's actually true. And yet, we again return to the idea that women fear being perceived as sluts. They obviously do to a certain extent given the culture of slut shaming, so that's correct. And if it is really a good experience, then fantastic. I don't care if it's a committed relationship or a one-time fuck. If they both have a good time, then that really is fantastic. The issue with the slut narrative is how it ties in with concepts like LMR, let alone all the other baggage I've prattled on about ad nauseum for the past 8 essays. Just because you got the result, sex, doesn't mean you know why. Nor does it mean that you ought to have done what you did to get the result. Dr. O'Neill says as much here. Quote, "I refuse to accept the premise that simply because some women go along with and indeed may endorse the use of seduction techniques, these practices are therefore unproblematic." End quote. You might reply, but doesn't that fall for the same trap as Tomasi's dictum that you shouldn't listen to what a woman says? If she says she's okay with it, shouldn't we take her at her word? That's a really good point, and one that demonstrates the complexity we're dealing with when we get to questions of agency, communion, and autonomy. I'm going to get deeper into that in the next essay, so don't think I'm sweeping that under the rug. However, just because something works And just because a woman says she's okay with it, doesn't mean it's a good thing to do. Again, I can gaslight a woman into bed and then abuse her into feeling too worthless to ever leave and so attached to me that she'll resist others' attempts to help. Great. I got sex in a consensual, long-term relationship. But I don't want to meet the person who would ever justify that. So while the vast majority of pickup tactics are not to that extreme, there is still a massive gray area that exists in between, in which toxic actions are justified because you got the result and you know why. Exactly why. Because women are simply like that, given their biology. And we have to accept the cold, immutable, unchangeable reality of the game. Denying that there is a game is one sin. It is. But acceptance of such a game is one of an even worse magnitude. However, with all that being said, what happens if you get the sex and she doesn't enjoy it? Now your immoral yet necessary actions are not met with the promised positive outcome. Elkin colleagues refer to promissory futures as moral settling rather than settlement. A moral settlement is where the dilemma is resolved. Moral settling is where the dilemma is never truly resolved because the nature of the promissory future slides that resolution into the future. It will be resolved once I will have done all the things you don't necessarily want me to do. Through the promissory future of a positive sexual or romantic experience, the pickup artist settles the moral dilemma of viewing a woman as an object to be manipulated through technical skill rather than as a moral entity that ought to be afforded her own self-sovereignty. Once you learn pickup well enough, you will have had enough sexual experiences to be able to make the pickup process and the sexual hookup fun enough that she really will have enjoyed it. Through this promissory future of the good pickup and the positive sexual experience, her definition as a moral entity is itself made into a promissory future in which she will have been the means by which you achieve the end of treating women in general as moral entities. And how do I know that she will have enjoyed this? Because I know that her biology dictates that this is what she experiences because I got the sex. If I got the sex, then that means the ideological matrix I swim in is justified, and the promissory future I envision in which she will have enjoyed it is further justified. Her right to be seen, known, and valued as a moral entity is forever slid into a promissory future that never quite arrives. And yet, with all of that being said, are we really going to say that any man who ever tries to get better with women is by default becoming better at manipulating women as a technical problem? That's a horrifying thought. Consider all the romantic hiccups you've experienced as a man. If you're a woman, think about all the times a man has hiccuped in your face. Think about these men we've discussed in this essay who have been thrown so far off the path we'd hoped they would have taken. Are we really going to condemn all of them to inability at best or criminality at worst? That's where we turn to in the next essay. Until then, thank you so much for your time and attention. Please hit the like button and subscribe for more conversations on masculinity, psychological development, and the cultivation of a personal mythology. Thanks again, and all the best to you on whatever journey you find yourself on.